Welcome to Hydroterra's webinar presentation series. Today, the cumulative impacts from coal seam gas and mining, an adaptive framework in action for modelling and monitoring. First of all, we'd like to begin with an acknowledging that we conduct our work across this great land, and for that privilege, we'd like to thank the traditional owners. Hydroterra respectfully acknowledges the Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, where we're located today. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present. Today, joining me, Troy Thompson, is Sanjeev Pandey, Executive Director, Office of Groundwater Impact Assessment, and Gerhard Schoening, Director, Office of Groundwater Impact Assessment. Thanks for joining us, guys. About today's presenters, Sanjeev Pandey. Sanjeev is a strategic leader and hydrogeologist with about 30 years of public and private sector experience from Australia and overseas. His expertise is in regional scale groundwater resource assessment, management and policy formulation. Currently, he leads the Queensland Office of Groundwater Impact Assessment, OGIA, an independent entity for the assessment and management of cumulative groundwater impacts from resource development in Queensland. In the past, he's been intimately involved in numerous assessments of the Great Artesian Basin and the development of strategic policy and legislation for the groundwater management in Queensland. Gerhard Schoening. Gerhard has more than 15 years' experience working on various Australian groundwater systems with the state and national significance. The Director of Assessment and Modelling at the Groundwater Office Impact Assessment, Gerhard has a multidisciplinary geoscientific background with a focus on hydrogeological characterisation, leading groundwater assessments and implementing data assimilation to support decision support modelling. Today, if you would like to ask questions, please use the Q&A button at the top of your screen to register a question. Please do not use the chat function. We'll get to those questions at the end. Hydroterra runs this webinar series for a number of reasons, but predominantly to share knowledge of Hydroterra's specialist monitoring suppliers and connection to ensure our clients and colleagues are updated with the latest environmental monitoring methodologies and technologies, to facilitate education of our clients and colleagues to allow appropriate adoption of technologies in the future, and lead industry by understanding the needs of industry. We look forward to hearing from you through the Q&A.
Thanks, Troy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Troy. And before I start, thanks to Richard as well, who approached us for this presentation and share, some of our learnings from the process. So that's really good. And of course, thanks to all of you who have chosen to, rather than just going out and enjoying Friday lunch outside, just sitting in the office and listening to us. So we really appreciate your time. So what me and Gerhard would be covering, that's the kind of territory. I'll start with the cumulative management framework and particularly focusing on, what really brought this, what are some of the key drivers for this framework, and some of a bit an overview of the framework. And then from there, I will present some examples, how that management and framework action is being in action and some of the examples that would help understanding of the framework. And then I'll pass on to Gerhard, who is sitting next to me. He will run through kind of a deep dive into some of the technical matters, particularly focusing on some of the technical challenges and how we have innovated around that and how we've addressed some of those challenges. And then I'll wrap up with some of the key learnings, and that's just the one slide finally to wrap things up. And as Troy said, if you've got any questions, let us know if there is anything while we're presenting and there's any burning questions that might kind of hinder understanding of some of the subsequent things. Please feel free to interrupt in the process.
Sanjeev, I'll just say quickly that This presentation today is particularly close to our hearts at Hydroterra because we've done a lot of work in the Surat Basin, assisting the industry with our real-time integrated monitoring groundwater solutions, with data ultimately ending up back with you guys at the Office of Groundwater Assessment.
Thanks, Troy. Yeah, that's really good. And I think just getting sharing some of these learnings have got a lot of mutual benefits for all of us. So before I begin, I thought just slide one slide because this is kind of primarily the area we would be talking about. So just give you a quick context about the hydrogeological framework and geological framework. So the area that we're talking about is southern Queensland. That's the Surat Basin and Bowen Basin, southern Bowen Basin in particular. It's a big area. It's about 400 kilometer wide to 500 kilometer long. The Surat Basin sits on top of Bowen Basin. If you look at kind of a excuse me, the 3D schematic of that area. The Bowen Basin just sitting here, and hopefully you can see my cursor there. So Bowen Basin's Permo-Triassic Basin around, the deepest part, it's close to 2 to 4 kilometers deep, so fairly deep. It does come out on surface and outcrops around that area further north. And above that, we have Surat Basin, which is kind of Mesozoic sedimentary basin. That also pops out on surface around, on the eastern and most of the northeastern part of the basin and that area. Surat Basin is particularly important because it's also part of the Great Artesian Basin, or GAB as we know it. It's a very important source of water supply for agricultural and stock and domestic use in that area. Particularly in some of those areas, there is no alternate water supply sources in there. And then, interestingly, with the Surat Basin subcrops, it's actually overlain by, in this part, Cardamom alluvium, which is a very important source of water supply for agricultural use in that area. And a very significant one, close to 50,000 megaliters of water is taken from that floodplain. So in there, if you look at, some of the kind of receptors in that sense, so there's quite a few GDEs, particularly the GAB springs further in northern area of the basin. And then there are also a number of water supply bores in the GAB as well as in the Cardamom alluvium. And then you have these couple of coal mines, which are, where the Surat Basin outcrops, the coal mesas, that's where the coal mines are located. And then the CSG wells. CSG wells normally tap somewhere between 200 to 800 meters deep, around that range. And then we have some of the conventional wells as well. Conventional oil and gas is fairly limited in that area. It's pretty much at a fairly mature stage and the kind of the tail end of development. And the coal formations, both in the Surat Basin and the Bowen Basin, and they are the part of the main target for CSG production. I assume and I take that most of you are reasonably familiar with how CSG is produced. But just briefly, the CSG target formation, they get depressurized in this area anywhere from 150 to 700-800 meters in some areas. And that depressurization in that process, the gas is released and collected on surface and taken through pipelines. The CSG wells are fairly closely spaced, unlike conventional oil. The generally around this area is anywhere from 500 to a kilometer from each other, so fairly closely placed. So with that, if I can take you back to 2009 and how the scene was at the time and which kind of drove this framework. So back in 2009 and 10, around that period, there was LNG boom. The number of major projects were proposed. At that time, I think there were about 8 different projects. totaling, the economic value about $40 billion per annum was projected at the time. And there was proposal to take about 200 gigaliters, that's 200,000 megaliters of water, to depressurize these coal seams. So you can imagine the scale that we're talking about. And at that time, the proposal for about 30,000 CSG wells. So the whole area was going to be peppered with these CSG wells. And in that context, as you can see on the map there, all these different proposals, they had their tenor boundaries pretty much next to each other. So fairly kind of complex environment. And you can see in that environment, there's obviously quite a few perceptions, issues were raised. And groundwater and land access was pretty much at the top of the list. There's major concerns about groundwater, particularly because there's about 70 to 80,000 megaliters of water that's been taken for agricultural and town water supply in that area, mostly from GAB, what's going to happen and how it's going to impact GAB. And there were fear that the GAB would pretty much get drained in the process. And there, of course, there is early EISs, there is multiple assessments, all saying the different things, different assumptions. So you can see how confusing that environment must have been at the time. And I was very fortunate to be there in that thick of things pretty much from day one there. And there were a lot of kind of mistrust with the industry, which is not uncommon. So landholders are not trusting companies' assessments because they're all saying the different things. And to make things complicated, I think some of the messaging was very interesting as well. I mean, there's one thing that comes to mind. Some of the messaging was that because GAB, we would only be taking 200 max, which would be just only a fraction of percentage of the total storage in GAB. So, it's unlikely to be an issue. And you can imagine for a landholder who's got their bore, pretty much where the CSG operations are proposed, those kind of, things really doesn't matter. They're more worried about water supply to their water bore. And of course, the regulatory framework at the time was not really geared for major projects like that with this scale of groundwater extraction, let alone in an environment where all these 8 different projects concentrated in one area. So that's the kind of environment we're working with. And the government was at the time was reasonably clear about just finding the right balance between the economic development and the opportunity it will bring, but making sure that the landholders' rights are protected. And as well, I haven't not listed there, but it's implicit, is all the environmental assets are protected as well. So to address those issues, that's when the Queensland government brought this framework. And as I said, I was fortunate being in the thick of things at the time with this one. So as part of that framework, as you can see on the right-hand side, a cumulative management area could be declared covering all those tenures where impacts may overlap. So it doesn't mean that, they have to be next to each other, but if the impacts are likely to overlap, then a cumulative management area could be declared. And that's kind of, you can see that's a dark blue line, the zigzag line all around. At this point in time, there's only one cumulative management area in Queensland, and that's called Surat Cumulative Management Area, even though it does cover the Southern Bowen Basin and all the coal formation, the CSG development in underlying Bowen Basin as well as conventional oil and gas and coal mines in the Surat Basin. So as part of that, if once a cumulative management area, or CMA as we call it, once that's declared, then that's where we come into play. That's Independent Office of Groundwater Impact Assessment. So our role then is that rather than industry and companies doing their modeling and assessment, particularly for cumulative assessment, we undertake cumulative impact assessment that includes conceptualization, modeling, and all the hydrogeological investigations that's needed for that purpose. And then we develop strategies for managing those impacts. And that's very important part of it. And uniqueness of this framework is that it does cover the territory from impact assessment to management. And the aspects of management that are included are, how you manage impacts on water supply bores, how you manage impacts on springs, and what should be the monitoring framework and monitoring network. And as back end of that, we are also required to assign all the responsibilities for specific actions that's needed by individual tenure holders to avoid any confusion because their impacts can overlap. We also maintain under another statutory responsibility we have is to maintaining all the monitoring data in this area and maintaining all the water board data, as well as supporting implementation of this assessment. Now, perhaps the most unique and important feature of this is that this assessment is not static, unlike EISs. This assessment is an iterative assessment. So it kind of follows typical cycle of modeling, monitoring, and reporting. And we put that in a statutory report called Underground Water Impact Report, or UWIR, or UA as we call it. And we do it every 3 years, give and take. So the first report for reference, the first report that we did, and said I've been involved in all of them since beginning. The very first report we did back in 2012 was done on a very little information or data we had. There's only few CSG wells at that time, so we didn't have much information, very limited monitoring, just handful. But we started building kind of a framework of an assessment and kept improving to a point. Currently, we absolutely swamped with data, and that's something Gerhard will present quite in detail too, and how we manage and take that to make assessment from that data.
So Sanjeev, did that include specifying the scope of the monitoring that you needed for that data, or just the existing data?
That's correct. So yes, it does specify. So as part of the management strategy, we keep revising the monitoring strategy with every UA. In the most current UA that we released in November, December, we have got 888 dedicated monitoring points that are part of the network. That's a statutory network. All those 888 points been assigned to individual tenure holder. So they are responsible for maintaining those monitoring points. And it's a statutory responsibility. The data comes back to us and we maintain the data. So it's very specific for that purpose. And that's not the only monitoring data. We got 3,000 other monitoring points, which are not part of the statutory network, but they also form part of the assessment. We'll touch more on it a bit later on. So just in terms of, OGIA and, as who we are, so our funding is through an industry levy, which is a beautiful arrangement at this point in time and has always been. And that levy is based on tenure footprint. So we often get asked the question, if the industry doesn't like, you are dependent on industry funding and they might not fund you. But the way the statutory levy works is based on footprint. As long as they have tenure, there's certain structure and formula for that levy based on, what we need to do for our assessment. And that's a mandatory levy on them. And the other question we get asked often is that, what powers we have to get the data, because that's where most of the time there is a struggle. Again, we're very fortunate through this framework is we have a statutory powers where we can request any information, any data from tenure holders, regardless of whether that's commercial and confidence or not. Of course, we manage information in a proper way. As long as that information is necessary for our assessment. Having said that, I must say that the coordination and collaboration with the industry has been absolutely fantastic. I think we've all come together. So rarely we use, that information data. Once we request, we most of the time we get that data and information, and rarely we had to use those statutory notices. We have used once in a while, but absolutely fantastic collaboration and support from the industry in that regard. And, our capacity, most of work we do is, in-house. We bunch of, as often I introduce, bunch of nerdy folks, modelers, hydrogeologists. I'm a hydrogeologist. Myself, Gerhard is hydrogeologist. We've got 7 at PhDs in our group. And the work we do is kind of the way we operate is in the spectrum, the kind of a consulting environment and a pure research environment. We are somewhere right in the middle of that spectrum where we do, things that needs to be done, but we also drive a lot of research based on it. By the way, that picture, my team insisted that given it's Friday, that I use this specific picture to show the makeup of our team. So it's a happy little team there. Okay, and what our operating mode is, how we operate. As I said, we have a strong focus on need-based pragmatic research. We focus on fit for purpose science, particularly. And one thing that we put a lot of effort on is just making sure that we bring stakeholders along the journey. And we do a lot of science communication in that process. We have never taken that approach of no, we're independent, so we cannot talk to industry, we cannot talk to landholders. On the contrary, we have extensive ongoing engagement with them, which really does help us to understand, a lot of contextual information, issues, problems, and making sure that we're solving the problems that are needed to be solved, and the research that hits the mark as far as stakeholders are concerned. So from that, assessment and management, as I said, it's the key framework, and I'll just run through some of the very, very high level things from our latest underground water impact report to give you a picture. Every year we do reconcile all the information. As I said, we get all the petroleum and gas wells and CSG wells and waterborne information. So remember I was saying, there's about initial proposal was 30,000 CSG wells. As we speak now, currently there's about 11,000 CSG wells, which is projected to go to about 21,000. That's based on tenures that's already approved, the EIA, for which they have already got environmental authority. So it's kind of firm plan. And it's been progressing, it's been ramping up. It ramped up pretty quick from 2005 to around 2014, 15. And kind of started stabilizing a bit. And in the process, CSG is taking 52,000 megaliters of water, not 200,000 that was initially estimated. In fact, in our first year, our estimate was somewhere around 90,000. With every year, as the modeling and more information keeps coming, that number has been coming down. But for last kind of 5-6 years, it's been hovering around 50,000 plus minus. And as I mentioned before, for context, around that area where the CSG is being developed, there's about 58,000 megaliters of non-CSG, that is consumptive water, that's been taken. Coal mining, even though there's often different perceptions, but the coal mining, including New Auckland and all, in comparison is less than 1,000 megaliters of water that's been taken. So it's fairly small proportion. So is conventional oil and gas.
Sanjeev, in your opinion, with that 52,000 consumptive and the non-consumptive use, is that sustainable with the recharge rates for the catchment?
That's a bit more complicated. If you don't mind, if I can bring that and answer that question once we run through, and Gerhard would be running through some of this stuff, might give a bit more context.
Thank you. I've jumped
but if
again.
you can hold that, but no, you're right. So, but just remind me to get back to that question, because we often do get that question of sustainability. So as I said, I won't go through the heaps of things, and I welcome you to go and download the report and read through. But some, if it's in the higher level, as part of that report, we make predictions in all the short-term predictions, which are kind of what's going to happen in the next 3 years in terms of drawdown impacts, and then long-term, which is the life of the industry and beyond. So that goes up to hundreds and thousands of years. What's going to be the maximum impact? So that's kind of just presents a simplified picture on the right-hand side, how that's going to be distributed. We do undertake uncertainty analysis, which we've been doing pretty much since 2012. And we do have these predictions for each and every aquifers. And behind that is a very, very complex model. You'll again keep saying Gerhard will touch on that. There's very complex models sitting underneath it. In fact, that's one of the most complex models around the world in that sense. It's got about 34 layers and all sorts of complexities in there. We can talk forever if we get into that.
Sanjeev, was this model predicted before extraction approvals or after the approvals?
So, sorry, just getting a phone call. So this cumulative impact modeling work came kind of, I would say, came halfway through. So before that, some of the projects were already approved and other projects were approved afterwards when this cumulative assessment was completed. And it's been underpinning, for kind of broader management as well in that space. Maybe if I can just touch back on the question of sustainability, and so maybe that's probably might be a better idea to touch it now. So in Queensland, this always been the case that the petroleum and gas industry, they have been having what they call this statutory right. That right is that you can or they can, and now the coal mine dewatering in the same category, is that water can be taken as long as certain obligations are met. And it's called associated water. So it's specifically meant for situations where the mining and petroleum and gas development, it's the primary purpose is not to take groundwater for consumptive purpose. It's an incidental taking of water. It's necessary to, extract coal or produce CHG or some water that's produced in conventional oil and gas operations. Now, often it's quoted that in Queensland, this is a free right to water. That's not quite true, because if you compare, if there is a landholder and yes, they do require license and go through all the sustainability water planning processes in that process, but they're not required. There is no further obligations on them. While with this one, then they have to undertake modeling, they have to go into make good, they have to go into a lot of mitigations measures. So that right, yes, there is that right, but it's subject to a lot of those other things as well. So that's why I think it was important to mention, now looping back to the question you were asking, is when these approvals were given, any impacts were considered at the time. Cumulative impacts, yes. Cumulative impacts were not understood that well. And that's why a lot of the conditioning was based on, when this framework was put in place. And the understanding was that this framework will provide, all the cumulative assessment and management. And a lot of the approval conditions were cross-referring to that cumulative arrangements. And, as I said, it's a long conversation, so happy to get back on that later on. Okay, the other thing that has kind of popped up in last couple of years, and we have gone in that space, is about the CSG-induced subsidence, looking at the community concerns and the issues that had been raised. So last 2 years, and this particular one is from 2025, we have developed geomechanical model. In fact, we have developed some innovative techniques and we published papers as well, where we have brought geomechanical modeling and groundwater modeling together. And again, Gerhard will touch more on it a bit later on. So that's kind of impact assessment. Now, as I said, that impact assessment is just not done for the sake of it. It's directly attached to management framework. And one critical part of that is what impacts are going to be and how many water supply bores are going to be impacted and how are we managing that. So as part of the framework and the assessment we have done, at this point in time, there's about 747 water supply bores that's likely to be impacted in the long term. Out of that, 76 are likely to be impacted in the short term. So this is in the next 3 years, and we do it with every iterative assessment for the next 3 years. If we go back to the very first year, because these short-term impacts bores are progressively identified, So far, we have identified 350 short-term impacted bore. We call them IAA, or immediately affected area bores. And it's for these IA bores, once the UR identifies an IA bore, we also assign to particular tenure holders, then it's a statutory responsibility on them to go and do a bore assessment, and they have to do a baseline assessment before that. Then they do bore assessment to establish that the impacts that are predicted, whether that's likely to impact water supply or impair water supply, and if the water supply is likely to be impaired, then make good. They have to reach a make good agreement with landholders. Now, the other part of this is, and again, this has been what's very hotly debated at the time, was whether the management action should be based on monitoring or should be based on modeling. Our view had been that because the management arrangements, the make good arrangements needs to happen before somebody's water supply is impacted, hence there is emphasis on modeling, and hence they're based on the predictions, so that before the impact could happen, those actions are in place. So that's about water supply bores. In terms of monitoring, and as we were saying before, I did mention about those 888 water supply, sorry, the monitoring bores. So this is a dedicated monitoring network, and I think as far as I can see, and I've mentioned a couple of times, this is perhaps one of the most extensive monitoring network anywhere in the world, particularly considering that many of these monitoring points are more than kilometer deep. And that is because of that, our understanding of the system has enhanced quite dramatically. And, it's a kind of chicken and egg situation as well. The reason we have been able to establish this one is because as the industry has been developing and the responsibility has been on them, drilling monitoring points. And often we get it's a pretty standard question. Oh, you get your science sorted and then you come and we talk about development, but unfortunately it doesn't work. The development also provide response to system, and that's why that iterative cycle is so critical. So it's a very good network in that sense. And we're not limited to just those 888 monitoring points. There's about 3,000 other monitoring points that are incorporated in our assessment. So, and then GDEs, as I said, in the northern part of the basin, the number of springs, JB springs. So we do a risk assessment, and the threshold is very tight. It's about 0.2 meters. So if there is 0.2 meters impact, then we look at what the source is and available drawdown around that area and whole range of things. And as part of this, we identify which springs require mitigation plan and action plan, and then it goes back to industry. They develop that action plan, gets submitted back to us, and we look at the integrity of that plan before it gets implemented. So it's a fairly comprehensive arrangement in that space. I have not listed here the kind of most official and other terrestrial GDs things, but they're all part of this assessment as well. So that's kind of, paints a picture for you, the framework and few examples, hopefully, just puts you in the right context. And I'll now, unless you've got any burning question, anyone, I'll pass on to Gerhard, and he will just dive deeper into some of the technical aspects. So it's a very seamless system. So I'll slide my chair and
we're going to play some musical chairs here. Here we go.
Thanks. And I'll just remind people that you can put your questions in through the question and answer section, and we'll come to them at the end. Thank you.
All right. Well, g'day, everybody. Thanks for making the time to come listen to us on your Friday afternoon. So Sanjeev's given you a pretty good overview of the evolution of the framework, the intent, and kind of all the things that we are required to do under legislation. And the pure scale of the system that we're dealing with and the region, the cumulative impact area, the Surat CMA, brings with it a number of challenges. And I think today what I'd like to do is just kind of walk you through very briefly all the different parts of the impact assessment and just kind of talk through some of the key challenges that we face from a technical perspective to actually do the assessment that Sanjeev was just talking about. And the way I'm going to try and break that up is into these three components. The first being the data. So as Sanjeev mentioned, we have a statutory function whereby we have to maintain and collate monitoring data from the industry. But we also collect a lot of our own data. We do our own research projects, and we compile data from outside of the outside of the CMA and outside of our own monitoring network, which we then use for the conceptualization. So the next part I'll talk about is how we actually try to make sense of this information. How do we use a bit of a salience filter to try and understand what matters, what actually helps us resolve the problems that we want. And in order to really ask the questions about impact, about what data tells us something about impact that we can use in a model, and what information actually exists about impacts that are already occurring that we can actually use, first of all, to understand historical impacts, but also to constrain a model when it comes to predicting what might happen in the future. So I'm going to talk about these three things. I'm sorry, I can't go into too much detail. There's going to be lots of nice pictures up. If you're interested, there's going to be a lot more information on our website that you can have a look at and dig into some of the details. So when it comes to data, really the first issue that we face is data integrity. So our conceptualization and our modeling is heavily informed by the data sets that we hold. And so we face this challenge of curating this high volume data set that is growing every year. It's coming from different sources. It's coming from industry. It's coming from the government. It's coming from our own data sets. And so we face a challenge to actually curate that in the first place. And then actually making sure that the data is of high integrity, that it can actually be used to support the assessment. Because there's lots of data that isn't useful and potentially misleading. And so there's a lot of work that goes into trying to understand what can we actually use here. And so one of the first things we've done in that space was to construct what we call the data dictionary, particularly for industry. What this does is it provides a standard way for them to actually submit data to us. So it comes down to what fields we want, what kind of supporting information and metadata we want for different monitoring. All these things we need to be able to assess the data later and to make sure that it is actually useful. We also have some minimum standards for monitoring, and these have evolved over the years, where we now specify, how we want particular monitoring installations to be actually implemented depending on the purpose that they were designed for. So some of them might be nested, some of them would be looking at particular coal seams, some of them are looking at shallow systems, and depending on the purpose, we would set some very tight bounds in the monitoring strategy in the OGIA about how those things should actually be constructed. And then in recent times, we've actually moved to this online submission portal for the industry, and it's a bit of an ongoing piece of work, but essentially in the past, we would get data from different places and different times and different formats, and that would become a pretty manual task to actually QA and compile that. So now what we have is this online submission portal. It does two things. It creates a central place for tenure holders to come and submit their data. But it also has some automated tech checks or validation checks, which have to be run before the data can actually be submitted. And this makes sure that the data is actually in line with our data dictionary, that there isn't records missing, that we don't have strange jumps in the data set that don't make any sense, or that records that were previously submitted have changed for some reason. So there's all these checks that are now automated as part of our submissions process, and actually helps the industry as well to streamline the way that they collect and then submit data to us. And I guess all of this brings with it the challenge of actually storing the data. I can think back to a time 10 years ago when you're dealing with 75 different databases from different tenure holders, all in Access, some spreadsheets, some information here and there, and that was 10 years ago. So as the information grows, there's a need to actually store it in a central point of truth. And so we now have this data lakehouse in the cloud, where all the data that's submitted by tenure holders, once it's gone through those tech checks, is actually stored in a transparent way so that we can always make sure everything is coming from the latest and greatest.
Yeah, we have a lot of these real-time monitoring systems and appreciate the challenge with these big databases. Beyond those initial, I guess, filter automated checks, have you got any other ways you've gone about automating
Yep.
QA/QC?
So we obviously have those initial checks that go for validation, and they're more simple things like that the data is in the right format and stuff like that. But we do still have a human, a hydrogeologist, who looks at all this data and tries to understand if it's making sense with what we see around that bore or in previous records. And so there is on top of this automated checking, which has a lot of statistics and has a lot of outlier detection, we still have a human being looking at all this and making sure that we're actually willing to accept the data before it goes into our lakehouse. That's a good question, actually.
And do you see a role, I guess, for AI to assist you to automate that and make it more efficient going forward?
So we already use a lot of statistics and we use a lot of machine learning to try and understand data, but I think at the moment still, I'd feel a lot more comfortable with a human looking at that. There's a certain amount of hydro sense, I think, that is still required to make sense of the data, and that's something that I think for now is still only really achievable with experience for a human being. Maybe later, maybe in the future.
We won't put anyone out of a job yet, but
Don't think so.
moving on.
So there are a few other challenges with actually using that data. If we kind of think back to our main purpose, one of the things we need to do is actually try and understand the regional groundwater systems, the aquifers, the coal seams, the reservoirs, their interaction, the relationship between superficial and deeper systems. But we also need to process this large disparate data set in the way that actually helps us to extract information that's pertinent to impact. So that might be vertical head gradients, that might be subtle changes in water level, that might be things that are behaving just a little bit differently to the way we'd expect, so that we can also find potentially subtle signals of impact. Because as I'm going to show you in a minute, impact's not always super obvious. Sometimes it's a subtle thing and it needs a bit of a targeted approach to actually pull apart. But we do have this problem of a growing, well, it's a good problem to have. It's a challenge that we have this growing monitoring network. Back in 2012, we were sort of at 150 points, which is still a lot, but now we're at over 880. And if you take that with all those 3,000 monitoring bores from department and elsewhere, we're looking at an extremely large data set. So how do you kind of not mistake the forest for the trees and actually try to find the things that are really screaming out from the data? That's our big challenge. And so we very much take an approach of narrowing down to the things that really matter, starting off with defining the areas of interest. Not everywhere is in an area that could be impacted. Focusing our data quality control specifically on those areas. So we actually have people going through, assisted by some nice technologies, to look at all the monitoring data and actually try to tag what they think is going on at these different places. Then we've got these potential areas of impact, areas where impact can actually occur because of things like changing head gradients or new drawdown that wasn't there in the past. And we do that all at a pretty regional scale with the hope of then identifying specific sites that need a bit more work. And a bit more work might mean looking at other evidences about what is going on at that particular point. So I'm just going to show you one example. This is for the bandana coal measures, which is the Bowen Basin coal target. We've got coal seam gas here on the western margin as well as the eastern margin. But we're just going to look at this little area up here where we've got coal subcropping underneath the precipice sandstone, which is probably the closest thing to an infinite aquifer one could imagine. It's probably one of the nicer aquifers of the GAB. Really important water resource. Also one of the big sources for springs and gaining streams in the region. So our main, this is just to show you what kind of the regional picture looks like. If we look at pre and post injection, so they have an injection scheme in this part of the world. They're re-injecting CSG extracted water from the walloons. And you can see it has a very, very strong effect post injection, and you can see that in a lot of monitoring bores. And if you looked at that, you'd say, okay, most things are going up. That's good. But if we look at some of these things in a bit more closer detail, this is one example in the contact zone up on the north I was just showing you. Down here in, you can see my mouse, I think. This teal plot at the bottom is the re-injection volumes over time. And then this blue line here is a particular monitoring point that is pretty much in the precipice above that contact zone. Down here in purple, we have the CSG extraction over time. And what you can see is in about 2017 or so, the re-injection drops off by maybe a third. But if you look at the water level, which is now zeroed out at the time that re-injection starts, it actually starts to drop below the pre-CSG water level and the pre-re-injection water level, which tells us that there are other stresses going on in this part of the world. And given where it is, there's a potential that that could be coal seam gas. When we look at the underlying walloon coal measures, so here's the contact zone in dark, we can see the water production here. This is the water production at the end of the period. And what you see here is the wells that are at the edge here near the contact zone are actually producing higher proportions of water. So we actually look at water and gas, and these ones are producing more water for the same amount of gas. At the same time, we can see that the wells on the edge here actually have fresh chloride, so they have fresh water, which is a bit uncharacteristic for this part of the bandana. Both of these things are telling us there's a potential that we've got influx of water from this contact zone caused by the gradient from the precipice towards the CSG wells. So we flagged this as a potentially impacted site in the EWA, and we've been doing a little bit more work with some signal processing to try and understand the potential influences on this. And yeah, we're starting to get some really good results from noise transfer modeling that actually help us to understand the potential contribution from different things and help us test hypotheses about what might actually be going on.
Gerhard, are there any plans for any automated routines or alarms sort of based on this data in the future?
Well, we're looking at this iterative, like every year pretty much. So every time we get a new submission from the industry, we actually do the trend analysis again. And we are always looking at ways to improve that and automate that. So in the annual report, we always provide, so every year we do an annual report with an update to the trends, and we actually provide an update in that. And as part of that cycle, we're always kind of trying to update and automate the way that we process these things. So that's a long way of saying yes.
Thanks.
All right, multidisciplinary science. This is kind of the other challenge, is sometimes information is partial. Nothing can tell you exactly what's going on. Here's an example in the Condamine alluvium where in 2019 we interpreted some seismic data underlying the Condamine alluvium, and we found that there was a big fault called the Harane fault, which actually had the potential to offset the walloon coal measures against some other shallower units. Although the issue with seismic is you can't see in the near surface. So we didn't know if this fault actually extended up into the Condamine alluvium, and we flagged it as a potential. And so we undertook a lot of work in the last cycle to better understand the conceptualization at this site. This involved a 2,000 kilometer AEM survey, which we did some significant interpretation on. We did our own probabilistic inversions. We've been working to incorporate that into our understanding of the geology and the hydraulic connectivity. Here's an example of where you have can you guys see my mouse? I think you can, potentially. Yeah. The cross section down the bottom, you can see the Condamine alluvium there. At a few of these locations, we actually detected that these flower structures are actually creating leakage windows between the deeper lower springbok in this case and the superficial condamine. Not everywhere, but at a few locations, we've noted that that was possible. We then also looked at some hydrochemistry and looked at the dissolved methane in the condamine alluvium, along with some other indicators to help us understand if that was in situ or not, and actually found that there was a pretty good agreement between where we had these potential leakage windows and where the chemistry was telling us that we had potential indicators. And so this has kind of formed the basis of what we're now using to do some more local or sub-regional impact modeling, where we can actually use this information to constrain if impacts are going to happen, then it would be rather here than not there type thing. Sorry, I'm going to go super fast here. When we get to modeling, we've got this challenge that we've got all this data, this diverse, disparate data set I was just talking about, and we need to honor that in somehow. But at the same time, we also have to represent the relevant processes, the things that matter for drawdown, whether that's dual phase flow or whether that's the way that wells operate or whether that's superficial processes. And overall, we have to produce a quantified risk profile. What's the chance that a trigger threshold will be breached, that a bore will be impacted, that a spring will be impacted? And so we have this tension between these things. And so the way that we approach that is by saying we want to build receptacles for data. We want our grid and our parameters to be designed in a way that actually has a place for data to influence itself in the model. And so we want to avoid building super complex geology and things that are actually going to hard bake a result into the model, and we want to rely more on the data. But where we don't have data, we need to be process-based. So some things we do need to be able to simulate in the model. And so we have this hybrid approach of trying to honor the data where we have it and be process-driven where we don't have as much. Now I realize I don't have a lot of time. So what I'm thinking is I'll fly through the rest of this. And if there are any conclusions, we can ask questions later, that's fine. So what I was just going to do is just outline a few examples where we've had to deal with this problem of data assimilation versus process. Some of these are to do with parameter upscaling. Some of them are about representing dual phase flow, because we know that if single phase flow is probably likely to overestimate the impacts. Some of these are about how we represent the system in terms of its lithological segregation, about the ways that CSG wells operate as descending drains, about the potential for faults to connect up layers that were previously isolated from one another, about processes, about subsidence. There's been a lot of work in the last couple of years about understanding how subsidence occurs and how we can use these processes and the data that exists about subsidence to actually improve our groundwater models. And probably most fundamentally, and this is going to be one of the big challenges I'm going to talk about in a second, is assimilating this data. Like we have this multi-component objective function. We have water pressure data. We've got water production data. We've got now hundreds of thousands of INSAR observations. And so this is a big challenge to be able to assimilate that in a way to actually reduce and constrain the uncertainty of our models. And then more so, as we get more data, we also have this challenge of more problem-specific models. So we have a broad spectrum of questions to answer. And so we now need to start building some more sub-regional type models to address those. And perhaps this is the big thing, I think, as much of what I've been talking about has been about data, that is also the ongoing challenge, is that now we've got all these conventional data sets that are already expanding every year as monitoring continues. We're getting new data from things like AEM and INSAR, which we think we can use to calibrate a groundwater model. We're constantly getting new observation targets. And so we face this observation overload where we have too many points that we can actually use. The Jacobian that you have to calculate to do this is actually too big. It doesn't work. And so we need new solutions to actually make use of this data. And some of these might involve problem-specific models. Some of it might involve dimensionality reduction or pre-processing the information like I showed you with those transient models, or faster running models like surrogate models, or even moving towards more data-driven and less process-driven where we've got the data.
Just a couple of things on that slide.
Yep.
Can you just extrapolate on what AEM and INSAR are?
Oh, sorry. Airborne electromagnetics is AEM. It's a geophysical technique. It responds to the electrical conductivity or the resistivity, depending who you ask, of the ground. And we've been using it a bit to understand more about the relationship between aquifers that are, really shallow, sort of the top sort of 250 meters or so. INSAR is interferometric synthetic aperture radar. It's a satellite technique. It measures ground deformation. That map on the right is an INSAR map of displacement over time in the Surat, and you can see those big red areas. That's where we've got about 15 millimeters per year of subsidence. Turns out that is intricately linked to parameters that we would use in a groundwater model, so particularly specific storage. And so we've been building some sort of hydromechanical coupled models to actually calibrate our groundwater models using this.
So also,
that
you're
kind of
pointing
answer
to
your
there
question?
being too many data points here, Gerard.
Yeah.
What do you think would be sufficient in terms of a minimum amount? Was it like per day, per week, per month? Where do you think the minimum points would be?
In terms of monitoring
Frequency, yeah.
I think it just depends on the problem you're looking at. Sorry, that's a very general answer, but
yeah.
But we generally tend to look at things in the sort of daily range, just because we're looking at long time periods.
Yep.
All right, I'm going to pass on back to Sanjeev because I've taken more time than we've got.
Thanks, Gerhard. That was great. Look, I think I know we probably going over time, but just last slide pretty much, or maybe last two slides. So this one is important in terms of, the lessons that we have learned throughout this process, just doing this work in the last 15 years with 5 different iterative cycles. And as I said before, the importance of iterative approach and adaptive management, how important it is and how it has actually helped us in terms of building confidence on assessment, building confidence on different management strategies. So that's been absolute critical in that sense. And then the other thing that lesson I would like to share is the importance of keep talking to stakeholders, as I hinted before, is we do engage pretty heavily and often talking to landholders, sitting down and things that actually do worry them has really helped us understanding the problem far better in so many instances. Some of the information that's been shared by them, that's been an extreme mutual benefit for all of us and industry. I don't think I can overemphasize the importance of these conversations on both ends, from landholders on one side and industry on the other side. It is very complicated space, and it's very kind of hotly debated, and there's a lot at stake. From landholders' point of view, there is agricultural practices, there's land they've been looking after for so long. So you can imagine their interest, and of course the industry interest. It's a very complex environment to play. And often, having those engagements gets very complicated, but that shouldn't be the reason not to have them, as I said before. And then the importance of independence is, it really has helped promoting confidence and acceptability of the work, having a different perspective. So like when we're doing assessment, we tend to see, where the science is driving, where the assessment is driving, rather than overly worrying about, okay, if that what happens, that means this is what may happen to industry and this is what may happen to landholders, water supply board. And I say that in a kind of a respectful manner, and the point there is to it really help us to have a more objective view and provide the basis on which the decisions can be made and the management actions can be taken. And the proactive approach, and that goes not only in terms of technical aspects, as I said before, for make good and other things, but also in terms of engaging and understanding issues earlier. Once there is confusion and we lose narrative that's science driven. If we don't get on early enough, then we get driven by these other factors and gets very inefficient in the process. And science is not just a tick approval process. I think that's another reason I love this framework and then the way it's panning out is often in the EIS and the time of EIS, and the question was asked before, when the approvals are given, EISs are often done, and most of the time, when there's limited information available, and it's a static assessment. As more and more information does come later on, it really helps us improve the understanding and the knowledge. So it's more than just ticking box. It's really helping on the ground day-to-day management and decisions that's been taken in that respect. And then, of course, not the least is the funding arrangement. And we're very fortunate to have the funding arrangements we have, and that's an absolute blessing. So we're not really hostage to changing priorities and in the public sector, or changing priorities in the industry and elsewhere. There's a consistent, established funding base that's really supporting us. And I've been into conferences where we presented hydrological cycle, how the funding is pumped in at a time when and drained out rather at a time when it's most needed. And this kind of funding arrangement does help to address that particular situation.
Sanjeev, do you feel like the industry perceives you as an independent body or a quasi-government authority?
Look, those perceptions, as I said, we are in a very, very complex environment. Our independence definitely does get questioned, and this question does get asked. And at the end of the day, we're part of government, and yes, true. But I can, before me, I was, when we started this unit, I was directing Randall Cox, who was the general manager and previous executive director when we started this unit. This thing has been coming from day one, and I can say with every confidence that I've never experienced a situation where our independence would have been compromised. By and large, yes, there will be some perceptions, but by and large, our independence and our credibility has grown over a period of time. As I said, having said that, there would be few landholders, there will be few groups who would have different opinion in the same way from the industry. But if we get, that perception coming from both ends, then probably it's not necessarily a bad thing, and maybe we'll find the right balance. But by and large, we have got a very good support across industry, across research organizations as well. Research and work is well respected, and the landholders by and large.
Do you feel that if you were seeing a real impact, that you could actually stop coal seam gas extraction?
Okay, excellent question. So I should have emphasized that before. So this framework is set up. This is not about stopping the industry and in that sense and stopping development. The framework, the two ways it works. One is the decision based on the information available at a particular point in time. Is the decision was made to approve this work. Then our job is to make an ongoing assessment and kind of work on that adaptive management framework. Having said that, and it's hardwired in legislation, if any of our assessment is dramatically suggests that things are actually dramatically different than what was available and the information available at the time of approval of those projects, then there is a legislative hook to go back and review the environmental authority. So in a way, yes, when you say stop, yes, if there is suddenly we say, look, hang on, there's new information come into play and the impacts are going to be 100%, 200% different or anything like that, then there is definitely a provision for that. But at the very core, the framework is to manage impacts for the projects that's been approved. Having said that, in a cumulative management area, because a lot of projects that's been approved after our assessment came into play, and the government has used our assessment in deciding whether to approve or not approve those projects. So it has helped in 3 different ways. A, for adaptive management. 2, to see if there is anything dramatically different that we need to open an environmental authority. And 3 is that an area where cumulative assessment is being done, if we means, if the government is approving a project, what that says, and it gets considered in the process, if that answers your question. Okay, and that's the last slide. If you need more information, then, we've got website, we've got a number of those tools. As I said, we do put a lot of emphasis on sharing information, and particularly from landholders' perspective and information. And I was going to say something, I lost my chain of thought. Gerhard is pointing me something. Yeah. Gerhard asked me to be shameless and use this forum to let you all know that we advertise a PO4 and a principal hydrogeologist and a senior hydrogeologist position. So if you're interested, anyone out there listening to it, please feel free, reach out. This would have given you an impression of the kind of work we do. So if that interests you, we are the right place for you to be coming and working for us. So that's part of the formal presentation. Troy, I'll hand it back to you, and the questions and things like that, and I'll stop sharing my presentation.
Thanks, Sanjeev and Gerhard. Really impressive combination of monitoring, real-time monitoring, using that data and spatial data to bring us to a point where we can really understand much better what's happening in the system. We'll now move on to our early bird questions. Thank you to everybody who sent those in. A number of these have been answered through the presentation, but we'll just go through them and either of you can choose to take the question, but if we've covered that, please feel free to just move on. And then after that, we'll go on to the questions that have come up during the session. So number 1, how was the variations in monitoring data sources, private industry and government, impacted on modelling? And is there likely to be an influential change on the government's monitoring strategy by OGIA?
Good question. And I think we talked a bit about how while we have our own network, we do actually obtain the data from other sources as well, whether that be from government or from industry, or because industry have other monitoring as well, or our own monitoring. And we actually do a lot of value adding to that data set in kind of what I talked about, where we pre-process it, we try to correct it where we can, and we remove things that don't look or are not representative. And then actually we feed that back to the government as well. So a lot of our data also goes to the government databases in terms of monitoring. So there's a kind of feedback mechanism for us to improve some of the stuff that happens in the state. And then, sorry, what was the last part of the question? That was the first part.
Is there likely to be influential change on the government's monitoring strategy?
Yeah, so I guess from that perspective, it's kind of constantly being updated through our value adding to the monitoring data.
Okay.
And to add that, when we say gets the government monitoring strategies, part of the UA framework. So every time, when we do our impact assessment, we review and revise the monitoring network, the 888 monitoring points we're talking about. Yes, Troy, back to you.
How can regulators practically support waste management from extractive industries?
So look, that's a question for regulator. I think we do emphasize, we're not direct regulator in that sense. And I should have emphasized that upfront is we do not, as part of this cumulative impact assessment, we look at impacts of surface extraction of groundwater. We do not look at any, the waste management and wastewater management. So that's well and truly outside of our scope.
Thank you. Did you provide any input into the draft National Environmental Standard for matters of national environmental significance, specifically on the consideration of risk of cumulative impact to groundwater quality, availability, and GDEs?
So I think if that question refers to some of the recent things, I think more than that, what we have been involved is pretty much going back to 2010, 11, when these projects were being approved on EPBC, and then that concept of that matters of what you call MNES came into play. So yes, we have been having a lot of those conversations. We've been involved in the past. In fact, that has influenced the management of impacts in the Surat and Southern Bowen Basin by the federal government, to a point after a lot of toing and froing, that they are actually, all the conditions and everything is referring back to a cumulative impact assessment. So, there's very good synergy there.
What learnings could be applied to address shortfalls in the current methodologies for GDE cumulative impact assessment under the GABORA Water Plan and Water Management Protocol and the GBORA Water Plan Review?
Yeah, feels like there's more to that question. There's more context in there, but I think what we can say is that even though our focus of work is around CSG impacts from resource development, we have developed a model in that process. We have understood so much about the non-CSG water use, their extraction, like for example, water use monitoring, so on and so forth. And a lot of this information is available and can be used for GAB water resource planning process, including GDE, because we have done a lot of research work in terms of where the source of these springs, which aquifers are coming from, conceptual framework, and so on and so forth. In fact, it's a live conversation. It's outside of our scope, but it's a live conversation internally to see how this information can be useful without us getting involved in the process, because we've got a statutory bounds around us.
And how does the framework account for the propagation of coal seam depressurization across connected aquifers, and how is that validated through monitoring?
I think
that's pretty much, yeah. Sorry.
Oh yeah, I think we talked a lot about that. We keep talking about that, but that is essentially the purpose of the assessment. Yeah.
Yep. What are the impacts on groundwater used for agriculture? It's a very broad question.
Yeah, I think it's sorry, is it impacts of agricultural use or
impact
impacts
on groundwater used for agriculture?
I mean, that's pretty much the focus of this whole framework. So as I said, we identify water supply bores that are impacted, and framework and monitoring. So that's pretty much essential and core of this whole management framework. Yes.
And finally, are there techniques currently available to remediate historic groundwater impacts, and what is done to minimize groundwater impact for future projects?
So the part of the first question is now, those are, the historical impacts. Going into the future, I think, again, that's part of this whole framework. So the government, when they do make decision, exactly like when they make decision about licensing, they make decision about impacts of these projects based on any future impacts when they're approving these projects, and they're taken as acceptable impacts in some form. So again, that's kind of the backbone of this whole framework.
Thank you. Now we'll go across to our live questions from today. First one from Ian Marshall. Have any states considered the use of CMAs?
That's probably a question for other states, but in terms of conversations, yes, there has been a few conversations from some of the other states, but I think the political context, is very different, and I think that drives, where some of these frameworks go. I think that's where I can leave it. But in short, yes, there has been conversations, and they have come and met us to understand this framework. So there's always at officers level, there has always been a lot of interest and keenness on this framework, but we have not seen this being implemented and taking shape in other states as yet.
Thank you. Our next one from anonymous attendee. Does a project need approval from the OGIA to proceed? And then second part to that, how does the OGIA influence environmental approval decision making?
So the part of first question is straight away no, that's not our role. Part of second question, as I was covering before, is the information that we generate. So any project in the CMA that's being approved after the assessment has been done, it gets considered by the Department of Environment in approving the environmental authority. So when we say approval of the project, and approval of environmental authorities is a critical point, and that does get considered. And not only they consider what the impacts are and available information at the time, but also, if there are going to be impacts, how this framework is going to manage that impact. So yes, indirectly, information gets considered. If there are any questions, they do come to us and seek clarifications. But we are not in the process of signing a piece of paper saying this project should be approved or this one shouldn't be approved.
Thank you. The next one from anonymous attendee. When will the draft UWIR for the SMA be approved by DETSI?
So we released our draft report in October, then we had consultation in November, December. This is statutory process that we have to follow. We have submitted the report to Department of Environment and Science, or Tourism and Science, and currently the report is with them. They will take their time. I think that the statutory timeline is somewhere around March. That's when it's expected to be approved. If it gets approved with or without condition, or whatever the situation is, normally there are a few conditions attached to that. That's when the final report will become available to everyone. But the draft report is available on our website, of course.
Thank you. The next one comes from Bev Newton. The huge difference with water take is that 58,000 megalitre take from other use is replaced into shallower aquifers. The 52,000 megalitre taken by coal seam gas is water that is thousands of years old and not replaced. It is permanently lost. I guess we'll take that as a comment rather than a question, but would you like to comment on that?
No, as you said, it's comment. And, Bev is one of the landholders. We engage very heavily, and I think that I take that point very respectfully. I think that that's a point, that's a comment that's made, and can see the point.
Next one from Abel Emiraj. Thanks, Sanjeev and Gerhard. Great update and good to see the sustained effort over the years to manage the resources given the current prognosis prediction plateau/decline for the CSG and coal industries. Keen to hear your insights for avoiding legacy issues similar to the abandoned mines.
Yeah, so I think when you say legacy, and it's kind of in a hot conversation at the moment. When I say conversation, there's been discussions happening. I do not have any, ongoing role, or OGIA does not have. We don't formulate policy or legislation. But just going back to that legacy issue, so there's a lot of conversation and concerns about the legacy coal holes, because there's thousands of coal holes that are out there. They've been left open. We have looked at that systematically, and then we have painted, kind of an overview in our report as well, and the risk they pose. There are few perceptions, and broadly in terms of groundwater, they do not pose that bigger risk. That's our assessment. However, potential for free gas migrating through these coal holes, that's a separate issue, of course. I think the other legacy issue, and maybe that's where the question was, when the CSG wells, 22,000 CSG wells, in the post-industry, and I said that's has started coming on the radar. There has been few studies to look at, the construction of these CSG wells, not us, by other agencies, and that assessment this point in time is that the majority of CSG wells are properly constructed. They do not pose risk. But I think it's a fair point. And as we move closer to more mature stage of the industry, I think that is something have to be looked at in future.
Thank you. Next question from an anonymous attendee. Is the 58,000 megalitre consumptive use just from the GAB or including from the shallow non-GAB aquifers to the east? e.g. condamine alluvium and volcanic basalts? If so, what is the comparative GAB consumptive use in the CSG development area, excluding the non-GAB aquifers?
Yep. So that's 58,000 does include part of Condamine alluvium, because the whole of Condamine alluvium is around 45,000. So it does not include all of it, just part of it. And then some of it is in GAB. Now, where that 58,000 comes is to actually make a fair comparison. In our previous report, we used to do for the whole of CMA, but some of those areas are far, far away from CSG development. So to put the right context, we drew a buffer of about 10 kilometers from CSG development. It's 10, I think that'd be 15. I can't quite recall at this point in time. So we have a buffer around all the CSG tenure and say, look, within this buffer, that means within that impact footprints and roughly around that area, this is the amount of water taken. Doesn't matter, these are water supply bores. Doesn't matter. They're taking water from Condamine shallow aquifers or deeper aquifers to provide the right perspective. If we take the whole of CMA, then in the GAB is around close to 45 to 50,000 megaliters that comes from GAB, and there's about 45,000 that comes from Condamine alluvium, and there is some more. So I think in some of the earlier reports we used to report within the whole of CMA there's about 35,000 water supply bores and about 110,000 megaliters of consumptive water take.
Thank you. From Ian Marshall, do coal seam gas proponents ever challenge your assessments, and how are these challenges managed?
Yes, they do, and they happens at like as part of ongoing conversation. Exactly, we get challenged by landholders, and we systematically run through those things. More formally, as well as landholders, as well as CSG companies, when we produce our report, they do make submissions, and they have raised those things in the past as part of those submissions, and we've dealt with and we provide an explanation. I mean, one example would be, some of the work that Gerhard, and this is a recent example, some of the work that Gerhard was talking about in the precipice sandstone. Challenge is probably too strong a word, but it's asking the question, how it just come about, and we have provided that explanation. So yes, if you put in challenge, we get both from landholders as well as the CSG industry, and that's not a bad thing to happen. It's coming from both ends.
Thank you. From anonymous attendee, any regulatory barriers for data integrity?
The regulatory barrier for data integrity, not sure. That maybe a bit more context to the question would be useful. I mean, we have got, as Gerhard was explaining before, we have got checks and balances, and the data gets submitted to us as part of those 888 monitoring network. We run checks and balances, and if there is the issues, we go back to tenure holders. We require them to, if it's like, for example, there has been instances where monitoring equipments have not been working well. So we've gone back to them and I've asked them either they change the monitoring equipments or the driller replacement monitoring board, and that has happened. So if, integrity both from, the time the data is actually captured, secured, maintained, those processes in place, but maybe I haven't got the context right here. I don't know.
Thank you. The next one is another comment from Bev Newton. UWIR acknowledges some localized areas could be more than 250 millimeters over the life of the industry. This in reality is vastly understated when the amount of subsidence on our flat floodplain has occurred in only 30 months. Surface subsidence is linked to the amount of water and gas being extracted. High extraction rates is why we're significantly impacted, and this is not portrayed in this latest UWIR and should be. I don't know if you want to comment on that or leave it as a comment from Bev.
No, actually that provides an opportunity to make a good point there. So I think what Bev is, some part of it, and I won't get on to that, but just if you look at the point that's been made there, to use that to provide two clarity. One is our cumulative impact assessment is a regional impact assessment, right? So we often say when the landholders the tenant holders are looking some localizer issue, they have to use their own tools. We don't go to that scale. I mean, what is local, what is regional can be a bit subjective. What Bev is referring to is similar thing for subsidence. So the UWIR, the statutory scope for the UN in terms of CSG-induced subsidence is limited to regional scale assessment so that we can make an assessment of impacts on environmental values. Impacts on agricultural land, local scale impacts at the paddock scale are not part of the UWIR. We haven't talked about it today, but we have undertaken a separate pilot project, and Bev is part of that project. Is to look at farm scale assessment, not as part of the legislative requirement, but because we asked for some advice. Government is currently actively considering how to deal with that issue, so that should be able to. So we provide doing some technical work to inform that conversation to government, and they will make a future decision how to deal with local scale subsidence matters.
I'll just add, there's one last comment from Bev saying that she believes adaptive management does nothing for the landholders who are already suffering from the impacts now presenting.
Yeah, and I think that comment is specifically, I gather, is in relation to subsidence. Yeah, so it's noted.
Okay, next question. How many groundwater monitoring bores does Queensland Government or OGIA operate, telemated and standalone, as opposed to externally supplied groundwater data sets, and what site parameters are typically monitored or instrumented?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, there's those 888 WMS pressure monitoring sites that I was talking about. We also have a number of hydrochemistry monitoring, which we didn't really talk much about, but we have ongoing 6-monthly monitoring of CSG wells. So we use that to try and understand the potential for water chemistry changes, which could be signaling impacts from or water coming from another aquifer. There's a couple of hundred of those. We've also got the 3,000 plus water monitoring data from those other sources that we talked about. So it's quite a diverse network. We're looking at pressure, we're looking at hydrochemistry. The hydrochemistry stuff would involve your standard suite. We also do a lot of stuff with strontium isotope ratios. So we've found them to be quite useful in the past, depending on the particular problem that we're trying to ask. And we're moving more towards sort of multi-suite stuff where we're looking at relationships between things like methane and residual sulfate and alkalinity and stuff like that to understand potential connectivity from hydrochemistry data as well. So yeah, it's a pretty broad suite. I've probably missed a lot of stuff, but that just gives you an indication of what we're dealing with. Yeah.
We're running well over time. We've just got a few more questions. We'll quickly move through them if we can. From anonymous attendee, how do you communicate model uncertainty to the community, and how do you think other people in the industry could improve in their communications to stakeholders for model uncertainty?
I think it's a given, but not always the case, that us scientists have to understand what model uncertainty means. And I think it's often that someone could just put up a P50 or a P95 or P5 and we don't really think about what that means. And I think for us, it's more about wrapping that up in a risk assessment. That, the probability of a bad thing happening, I guess, or the probability of something being triggered. And I think it's more about synthesizing the uncertainty in a way that's relevant to the impact that you're trying to predict, rather than just put up these whole kind of holistic posterior distributions and things, because I think that's not super useful. So I think it's about risk and it's about communicating that.
Thank you. And Walter Wenig from Stantec, you presented a bit of information on subsidence as an impact. Is land subsidence part of the ongoing assessment and predictive modelling?
Yeah. So Sanjeev's got it. Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me okay now?
Yep.
Yeah. So, I did answer that before, is that the SASE-induced subsidence, there's a limited scope at this point in time in the UA, which is the regional scale assessment for the purpose of EV assessment, as I mentioned before.
And the final question from Jean-Philippe Tixier. To what extent do spatial and temporal gaps in groundwater monitoring datasets constrain parameter estimation, calibration robustness, and independent validation of OGIA's regional numerical groundwater model?
Oh, there's
another webinar then.
that's a good question. This is about data gaps,
Yeah.
or is it just about the data itself?
Because
Because there's a few things here. Because just because we have a lot of data, or just because one has a lot of data, doesn't mean that one has a lot of information. And a lot of our work is trying to squeeze the information out of the data that we do have. And a lot of the time, if you don't do that, you might miss subtle things. So we tend to focus a lot on extracting impact pertinent information from data. So if we think that there's an impact in a particular water level, we need a model to see that, not the absolute head. That's less important. At the same time, if we don't have any information, then that's particularly important for our understanding of the prior. And so the uncertainty has to reflect the fact that in some places we don't have information. And therefore our distribution of predictions will be informed by the fact that some places just don't have information. And that's an honest representation of what we know. So both of those things are true, but I think the big challenge for us is to try and extract information from data, because there might only be a couple of pieces of information in a million data points. So how do you get that? That's the challenge.
Fantastic. Thank you very much to Gerard and Sanjeev today. Really fascinating. Personally interested to see that the potential for a more simplified model with less data inputs looks like it could be an optimal way to provide forecast of management activity that's required, among other things. We'll just state again that, Hydroterra, this is very close to our heart, given our experience with monitoring in the Surat Basin. And we have specialised knowledge in long-term monitoring networks and deep groundwater sampling skills for dissolved gases. At significant depths, we've done up to over 1,200 metres. So this is really important to us, and we're really thankful for all that you've shared with us today. Thank you to everyone for all their questions, and hope everyone has a great weekend off the back of this.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for your time. Sorry you've taken a bit longer.
That's okay. We really appreciate the sharing. Thank you.
All right. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye.